Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorders, I step out the door, and deliver an episode to you while I walk the dog. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It's a lovely day here in suburban Chicago. It's quite warm. My phone indicated it's already 79 degrees, and it's barely 8 a.m., so I suspect by the afternoon it's going to be roasty, toasty, late summer or midsummer temperatures. I guess that's not surprising and relatively reasonable to expect, given that it's summertime. I was thinking about what to talk about today and reflecting on some recent fun gameplays I had. And one of my favorites recently, actually on my birthday, my family and I played Ark Nova. Ark Nova is a delightful game. It's certainly one I enjoy a lot. And those two things together make me say, I realize I should talk to you all a bit more about it. I looked through my podcast records, and as far as I can find, while I have talked about it a little bit, I haven't talked about it in depth. I haven't done a message from the deep about it. I haven't even done a duel episode. I thought about doing a duel between Ark Nova and Terra Mystica, but I actually feel like that isn't a very original thing to say. The early reviews of Ark Nova all compared it to Terra Mystica. Or not Terra Mystica, excuse me, Terraforming Mars. Every time I said Terra Mystica in the last minute, I meant Terraforming Mars. Ark Nova has been widely compared to that pretty much off the start. I think the two things that really connect it are the hex-shaped spaces on the boards and the three things, the giant pile of cards and the tags. But I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is a deep dive of Ark Nova, and what I'm going to talk about are 4 things I like about Ark Nova. I know I just did a 4 things episode, but actually I'm just calling this a message from the deep. This is a message from the deep, Ark Nova. If this were a bad serialized novel, it would say, message from the deep, Ark Nova, a 4 things podcast. Because I've grown to like 4 things as a model for what I might say in the podcast about a thing. So anyway, yeah, so this is a message from the deep about Ark Nova. Just in case anybody out there hasn't played, is unaware of Ark Nova, it's a 2021 game from Matthias Wigge, W-I-G-G-E. It was published by Feuerlandspiel and Capstone Games in the United States. It is a game where you make a zoo, and it is currently number 4 overall on Board Game Geek, meaning it's rated by Board Game Geek folks, which is a particular tranche of the board gaming community, but it is rated as the 4th best game of all time. And getting to 4th best in a 3-year period is pretty fast. They've released 1 expansion for the game called Marine Worlds, which I think is great. Go ahead and look at the Essential Expansions episode that I made recently to see why I think that. But suffice to say, Ark Nova with the Marine Worlds expansion is really great. So what I want to talk, if you haven't played it, it is a game about building a zoo. You have 2 competing score tracks while you're working on building your zoo. On one hand, you have the attraction, which is sort of like how popular your zoo is, and that's how much money it makes, your attraction level. And then you also have your conservation level, the idea being that zoos are a scientific endeavor aimed at working to preserve animal life. And so part of what you're trying to do is raise the conservation efforts around the world, and you do that as part of your zoo as well. And it's those 2 things combined that make your score. Now, the original game's scoring mechanism was that the game ends when those 2 scoring tracks meet, and your score is actually how far past each other they get. So you take the difference between your score in your score in one and your score in the other, and the distance between them after they've passed is your score. Similar to Rajas of the Ganges scores that way as well. Now, I don't like that scoring method because then you play a long time and you end up with a score like 20, or often 10 or 5. Or if you aren't the person who made your tokens cross and you didn't have a particularly great game, or you were just about to make a big move and you could end up with a negative score. And a negative score after a 3-hour game is not fun. So I generally don't like to use that scoring method. Instead, what I've done is I have taken from Board Game Arena. They've assigned values to the green spaces, the conservation spaces, and I've written those values on my board. And when you play Ark Nova with me, you add your attraction score and your conservation score to get your final score. I think it's a much more fun way to play, and I think everybody should do it that way. So what I thought I would do today to talk about what I like about Ark Nova is I am going to compare Ark Nova to 4 different games and talk about what I like in those other games and what I see in Ark Nova that's similar. So it's sort of here are 4 games that Ark Nova is similar to and what I like about them. So to start with, the first one I want to talk about is Terraforming Mars. As I said, when Ark Nova came out, Terraforming Mars was the constant and regular comparison point for Ark Nova, and with good reason. As I started to say earlier, both games have a giant pile of cards, each of which is unique, and each of which contributes to your process differently. Both games have a tableau building process where you are playing cards and they're getting laid out in a grid in front of you or an array in front of you, and they give you sometimes ongoing benefits, sometimes they give you one-time benefits, but either way, they contribute little symbols or tags to your zoo, and those tags then influence other things in your zoo. Now, the tag feature is something that's existed for a while. I think you could argue Race for the Galaxy has some of that. You could argue Seven Wonders has some of that, although there's overlap in just the card types as well. In Seven Wonders, you don't have multiple tags on the same card. But this is a feature that's been around for a while in a variety of different games, most significantly Terraforming Mars. In Ark Nova, you use the tags in your tableau to set up a variety of different things. Often there's scoring conditions where you have a certain number of tags let you trigger one of the scoring cards. It could also be a thing where every time you play or one of your opponents plays a particular tag, you get some money. It could be bonuses that you get based on tags you have or tags you're going to get. And often it's a limitation that you can't play certain cards until you've got a certain number of tags. So for example, you can't get one of the bears until you've already got a couple other bears at your zoo, because these bears are rare and you have to show you know how to take care of them or whatever. The game doesn't really provide that narrative explanation for why you would need a particular tag, but generally you can find an implication of one pretty easily. Both Terraforming Mars and Ark Nova also have a little bit of take that. Terraforming Mars has these red cards that take away people's stuff just a little. It's not a brutal change, but it can really affect you if you just played at the right time. And Ark Nova has a similar thing. One of the things I like about Ark Nova is that it's built with a solo mode in mind. So it's designed to be able to play by yourself. And those competitor cards don't really work if you're playing a solo game because you don't have anyone to screw with. So in Ark Nova, each competitive card like that has a direct conflict element also has at the bottom a shared, like a solo mode option. It's a positive benefit that you get for when you're playing a game where you don't have opponents. And in the rulebook, it says there's a variant if you want to play a cooperative game or a less directly competitive game. You can use the solo mode variants instead of the competitive elements whenever you play a card like that. And we always play that way because I don't really want to mess with other players' zoos. Terraforming Mars also has a shared board with hex spaces that you're building on. And I wonder if some of the overlap that people see is that you're also building in hex spaces in Ark Nova. Now, I think this part of the overlap is relatively minor. I think the main thing is huge pile of cards and an array of tags that slowly gain you bigger benefits over time. So that's where I see similarities that I like between Ark Nova and Terra Mystica. In Terraforming Mars. Next up, I also like Ark Nova a lot because of the theme. We really like animals, we pay attention to them, we go to zoos pretty regularly, we are interested in wildlife, and I am becoming an avid birder. All of these things really connect to the idea of games that have to do with wildlife. I have 3 games in my collection that have to do with wildlife right now, or with sort of zoos particularly. I have other games that have to do with wildlife like Cascadia and Wild Serengeti, but the 2 that have to do with zoos are New York Zoo and Barron Park, and then of course Ark Nova. So what does this game have what I like about this game that both New York Zoo and Barron Park have is the element of planning out your zoo. That both of those games have different shaped pieces that you're putting into a array or a display where you're building your zoo elements. Now in Barron Park, it feels much more like you are sort of putting out bare animal pieces, and whereas by contrast in New York Zoo, it really feels like a math puzzle that you're doing. But generally the overall effect is that you get to play around and plan stuff with zoos, animals, and that's really fun. I like the theme of animal stuff, and when you're playing a game like that, then it's really fun to try to get the animals that you like. Now, in New York Zoo, there's only 5 kinds of animals, so getting the animal you like isn't really as much a big deal. In Barron Park, of course, it's all bears. So the thing that Ark Nova really has going for it is it's a delightful display of different animal types. And it certainly is a thing where as you're playing, you might get an appetite for a certain kind of animal, and sometimes that benefits you from the game perspective. You know, if there's cards that reward predators, you might be trying to get predators, but you might also just have a thing you like. Like I got a lot of birds the last time I played. It did fit what I was going for, but it was also fun just to try to get a zoo that was sort of coherent and a collection of animals. Now, it is very much a tactical game in terms of building the zoo that fits the cards you have, but overall, it is really fun to collect the animals that you want. And I think Barron Park works that way a little bit, but is the least effective in terms of getting a reward for the kind of animals you want. New York Zoo has 5 different kinds of animals, and they're different types of, they're not all, ursine. And so you have a better selection, but nothing really compares to Ark Nova that I've played in terms of variety of animals that you could try to collect. I know there is a Zoo Tycoon game that came out. Now, it did come out after Ark Nova, so I'm surprised it did really well, but maybe people who, I don't know. There's lots of people who Ark Nova wouldn't be for them. It's too complicated. And so those people maybe really got a lot out of something like Zoo Tycoon. Either way, part of what I like about this game that overlaps with Barron Park and with New York Zoo is the planning of the zoo space, and more importantly, the acquiring of animals, the theme of taking care of animals in a zoo. The next game that I wanted to draw attention to as interestingly related would be the Castles of Mad King Ludwig. Now, Mad King Ludwig is a delightful game. If you haven't played it, you are an architect building a castle for the famous Austrian king or Prussian king. I'm not sure exactly which, but it's a famous king. You're building castles for him. He famously built these weird castles with all sorts of unusual things in it. Some stuff I've seen suggests that the idea that he was crazy was spread by his detractors in the royal courts who didn't like that he was spending his money on weird houses. I've read some interesting stuff trying to recoup his image, which suggests that he was actually a very good employer to the poor, and also one of the things I read was that maybe he was gay, and that the detractors calling him mad were doing it because of that. So I don't know how true all of that is, but it's interesting to think about in the context. Anyway, in Mad King Ludwig, you are building these weird castles and you're trying to get different rooms, and the different rooms have different scoring conditions that come up as they appear. This overlaps a lot with Ark Nova in a couple ways. One, there are a number of different sizes and shapes of habitats that you can build in your zoo. And then when you put animals in, you have to have an available habitat of the size and shape that you want to add to your zoo. And the game has lots of different nuances about that. Like this animal might require a certain size habitat, but to put it in there, you have to also have, it has to be built next to a rock, or built next to a rock and water, or next to 2 rocks, and so on and so on. So it's interesting to have to kind of plan ahead and really think about which habitat you're going to use. One of the innovations of the game that I really like is that the habitats are not assigned to specific animals, but instead the way it works is when you build an animal and you add it to your zoo, you then flip over a habitat for that animal, and that's it. You don't mark which habitat that animal is supposedly in. You just say, yep, we had room, now we don't have room. Now, if that animal leaves your zoo, you flip it back. I haven't really looked at the rules regarding herbivores, because there's a whole thing in herbivores where you can play an herbivore and it will get to share a habitat with other herbivores as long as it's the right size. And as far as I know, I have to look at what the rules say about if you get rid of an herbivore, do you flip that thing available even if you have other herbivores that were kind of sharing that facility? I don't know. Feels like you shouldn't flip it because there's other animals still in there, but the game again doesn't track where animals are. The other thing, so the variety of different sizes and shapes and the need to attend to what's around them is one of the things that reminds me of Mad King Ludwig. The other thing that reminds me of Mad King Ludwig is that there are a bunch of different sponsors that are corporate entities, or it's just an umbrella term for these different groups that will build specialized features in your zoo. And those specialized features will all have these weird shapes, and you're not allowed to flip them around. You can rotate them, but you can't flip them over. So they have to lie in one particular orientation, and it's pretty cool. But it also gives your zoo a little bit of a kooky feeling. If you're doing very many of those, then you start having this weird zoo that's full of all these odd-shaped pens because you're buying a lot of the wacky stuff. So from that perspective, I think the Mad King Ludwig is a pretty entertaining connection there. One of the big differences, though, is that Ark Nova does not have auctions, and every player gets one end of game goal, whereas in Mad King Ludwig you could get a bunch if you wanted. So, all right, the last game I want to mention, this one is not quite as elaborate, but I think is interesting there, is Through the Ages. Through the Ages is a very competitive civilization building game where you are arranging cards and you are building up this tableau of different technologies and elements, and you're trying to get up your score as much as you can. There are a couple places where it reminds me of Ark Nova, or Ark Nova reminds me of Through the Ages. One is the card river. Now in Through the Ages, the card river is segmented by time period. So the cards are divided into 3 ages, and each age is slightly more complex and more expensive and so on. Whereas in Ark Nova, all the cards are just mixed together. But you still have this row of cards that's constantly cascading down. And when a card comes out, you have to think very carefully about, am I willing to put some resources into getting that card early, or can I wait a bit and maybe someone else will snap it up in front of me? Also, over time, you get the ability to grab more cards more quickly, and that part feels a little bit like Through the Ages as well. The other thing about Through the Ages that feels like Ark Nova to me are these endgame scoring conditions that I mentioned while I was talking about Castles of Mad King Ludwig. Now in Mad King Ludwig, the endgame scoring conditions are things that you acquire as the game goes along. In Ark Nova, you just get a couple of them. You get one, you actually get 2 at the beginning of the game, and you ditch one partway through, so you only get to score 1. There are a couple ways to acquire another one, like I think the elephants, if you play the elephant, you get to draw one more endgame scoring condition. There are also a couple ways to draw new ones and discard. So you draw up and discard back down, so you have the same number you had before, but you could cycle out which ones you keep. There are also a number of different ways that you could put into place some endgame scoring, and because the endgame scoring is almost always the conservation rather than the tickets, not entirely, but almost always, you have this situation where your conservation score can jump up 10, 15, 20 points at the end of the game. And that effect reminds me a little bit of Through the Ages. And Through the Ages, you're constantly playing these culture cards. Each round you can play a culture card into the deck, and some of them will come up during the game, but some of them won't come up till the end. And if you know there's a culture card there and you make sure to keep it on pace, then you can end up coming out getting a big boost to your score at the end that the other player didn't know. I know regular listener Chris Hanji, hi Chris, when he and I play Through the Ages online, he regularly wins because I always go for points early and my late game is not good and his late game is really good, and so we'll get to the end and I'll be 20, 30, 40 points ahead at the end of a game of Through the Ages, and then the final point tally will come in and he'll rocket 30, 40, 50 ahead of me. At least that's what it feels like. I'd have to go back and check how close that is, but he almost always makes up ground in the end game. And Through the Ages definitely has that effect, or Ark Nova definitely has that effect. In fact, my wife, when we play, has come to think of it as like, oh, it'll feel close, and then we'll get to the end and Brendan will get a bunch more points. And that's part of the experience. But it's part of what I like about the game and what it reminds me of with regard to Through the Ages. So what games do you like in context of Ark Nova? Do you like Ark Nova? Do you not like it? If you don't like it, tell me why. If you do like it, tell me why. You can do all that at Board Game Geek in Guild 3269. Or you can send me a message. Wombat929 is my username on Board Game Arena, or Board Game Geek. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Oh, and if you'd like to play a game of Ark Nova, you can join me on Board Game Arena. My name is Wombat929 over there, and we can play Ark Nova. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.